Today, I will tell you 3 stories of Russian serial killers. I really need your likes and comments. Andrei Nikolaevich Evseev. Andrei Nikolaevich Evseev, known as the Tagansky Maniac, was a Soviet serial killer who operated in Moscow and the Moscow Oblast in the mid-1970s. Evseev was born in 1955. He left school after the 7th grade and worked as a model, laboratory assistant and sailor, but always quit because he didn't like to work. In the early 1970s, Evseev was placed in a psychiatric clinic. As he later told, "I left the hospital a complete fool for all the drugs that were injected into me in the hospital. I experienced a very painful state, difficulties in brain activity. I considered people to be my first enemies." The first victim of the killer was a 16-year-old schoolgirl named Marina Morozova, who was dressed in red clothes. The murder was committed by Evseev in the city of Zagorsk, now Sergiev Posad, on August 25, 1974. The following day, Evseev killed 66-year-old chef Gennady Kuzmin, stabbing him with a knife several times near the Odintsovo railway station, then robbed the corpse and threw him into a roadside ditch. Evseev stole money and a grocery order that was scarce in Soviet times, a broiler chicken and 3 kilograms of Bulgarian peaches. On suspicion of committing these crimes in the Kemerovo Oblast, 19-year-old Sergei Savliev, who deserted on the eve of the first murder from the military unit, was arrested, but he failed to prove his involvement, despite the fact that he confessed to the murder of Morozova. In September 1974, in Moscow, in the park of the Palace of Culture named after the Third International, Evseev attacked student Vladimir Parshin, inflicting 4 knife wounds on him, but he survived. On September 24, 1974, in Moscow, in a house near the Dobrynskaya metro station, Evseev attacked and robbed Anna Astafyeva. Despite being on the verge of life and death, she was able to describe the killer. According to her, the killer was a young man with sideburns and kind eyes. Soon after, the woman died in hospital. On September 26, at the 43rd kilometer station in the Moscow Oblast, Evseev attacked a man and seriously injured him. When attacking, the killer broke his knife and the blade was left stuck in the victim's back, who died later in hospital. The murdered man, who looked very similar to Evseev, was 42-year-old Nikolai Diamond, who had spent almost 20 years in prison. As it later turned out, Evseev committed the murder with the aim of confusing the tracks by putting his clothes on the man. Initially, the investigators even thought it was Diamond who committed all the robberies and murders. On October 8, 1974, in the Tagansky district of Moscow, Evseev made 3 robbery attacks at once. 2 of the 3 women robbed by him died from the knife wounds, and all of them wore red dresses. Panic began in Moscow, with people saying that the killer of women in red had appeared. On October 15, in the area of the Akademikskaya metro station, at intervals of 20 minutes, Evseev committed 2 more attacks on girls, one of them dying from the wounds received. On October 16, in the area of the Proletarskaya metro station, Evseev again made a double attack, killing one of the victims. But this time neither victim was wearing red clothes. After this, Evseev committed a series of robberies in Moscow and the surrounding region, but all victims survived and described the killer the same way. In connection with the panic in Moscow, the leadership of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the USSR decided on unprecedented measures. The Minister of Internal Affairs Nikolai Shelikov spoke on television, warning the citizens to be cautious. This frightened Evseev, who ceased his attacks for almost 2 years. In November 1976, Evseev committed 4 robberies in a month, 2 of which ended in murder. In the fall of 1977, Evseev hit the secretary-typist of the Central Committee of the CPSU Nina Dolingin on the head with a screwdriver, but she survived. The apotheosis of the criminal activity of the killer was the brutal murder of Lydia Kupriyanova, the wife of Soviet artist Mikhail Kupriyanov, RU, member of famous artist trio known as Kukriniksy. This time, for the first time, the killer raped the victim posthumously. 2 months later, on December 19, 1977, in front of dozens of people in the backyard of the housewares store in the village of Sofrino, he committed another murder. He took the watch, money, jewelry and a dog collar from the murdered Lydia Schur, raping her corpse afterwards. A witness to the last murder reported that he had seen a suspicious man in a corduroy jacket at the crime scene. The local drinking company said that with them appeared a certain Shanov, dressed in the velvet jacket. The jacket, on which there were blood stains and a knife was in one of the pockets, was later found. However, when Shanov was arrested, he reported that another man had given him that jacket, with subsequent examination confirming the man's testimony. Another witness said that he had seen a stranger on a train in Kotkovo, and that he was wearing a railwayman's uniform. When the database was picked up and according to it were selected suitable matches, 22-year-old criminal Andrey Evseev came up as a result. On December 28, 1977, the killer was arrested. On this day he had dressed the New Year's tree with jewels stolen from the victims. When they came for him, he hid the jewels, and there was nothing suspicious in Evseev's apartment, except for the dog collar stolen from the last victim. He explained that he kept it hidden as a memory of his beloved dog. At first he refused to give evidence, but on December 31, on New Year's Eve, while conversing with a cellmate, he dropped a strange phrase, "My mother, I suppose, already baked pies with jewels." The cellmate turned out to be an informant, and the investigators guessed that the stolen jewelry was hidden in a bag of flour. The conjecture was confirmed during the second search of Evseev's apartment. During the interrogations, Evseev was defiant and refused to communicate with the female investigator. He agreed to testify only after he was brought salted herring, which he ate entirely with bones. Subsequently, he confessed to 9 murders, 18 attempted murders, 1 rape and 32 robberies. As a result of forensic psychiatric examination, Evseev was declared as mentally competent to stand trial, but at the same time diagnosed with sociopathy. While waiting for the court, Evseev took care about himself and did exercises every morning. The killer felt no remorse for his deeds, claiming that he despised those who work and live from salary to salary. In 1979, the court sentenced Andrey Evseev to death, and he was soon executed by firing squad. Documentary filmed the murderer with Sideburns from the series The Investigation was conducted. Boris Vasilyevich Gusakov. Boris Vasilyevich Gusakov, also known as the Student Hunter, was a Soviet serial killer convicted for the killing of 6 people in the Moscow area between 1964 and 1968. Gusakov, a serial rapist with a history of mental health issues, committed 6 murders and 15 violent sexual assaults on girls and young women before being caught, and was executed by firing squad in 1970. Boris Vasilyevich Gusakov was born in 1938. In the Saltykovka district of Balashikha, Moscow Oblast, Soviet Union. Gusakov was born into a family of alcoholics and suffered from mental health issues from an early age, but these were often ignored due to the ongoing World War II. At the age of 3, Gusakov witnessed an eerie scene. A bomb dropped by the Germans killed several people, including a teenage girl who had her head blown off. Later on, during interrogations, Gusakov said that while committing attacks on his victims, he wanted to relive the scene he had seen in his childhood. In 1955, he graduated from the school, but did not enter higher education, and began working as a photographer. Gusakov married a librarian in 1958, and a daughter was born. He treated his daughter cruelly and tortured her. From 1958 to 1961, Gusakov served in the Soviet Army, and shortly after his discharge from the army he was convicted for theft. From May 1962 to July 1965 he worked as a photographer at the factory Kartolitography Gapu, where he was viewed positively by his colleagues. From August 1965 to July 1966 he worked at a laboratory for the film and photo department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. From January 1967 to January 1968 he worked as a photographic engineer at an oncology and chemical research facility, but was fired for violating labor discipline. From February 1 to February 23, 1968, he worked as a chauffeur at the motor depot of the Moscow Post Office. From February to May 1968, he had no permanent job and survived by doing odd jobs. Until May 14, he worked at the Moscow Children's Distribution Receiver of the UOP of the Moscow Executive Committee as the head of the darkroom. At the end of December 1963, the 25-year-old Boris Gusakov launched his first attack on a girl at the Moscow Institute of History and Archives. He was unsuccessful, however, as the victim resisted and broke free. When the child ran out into a yard, an outfit of the Komsomol fighting squad tried to detain the attacker, but he disappeared. At that time, it was suggested that the attack was carried out by another killer, Vladimir Ionsian, the Meskez killer, who operated in Moscow in late 1963. On June 21, 1964, in the Tomolinsky Forest Park located in the Luberetsky district, Gusakov committed his first murder. He raped and killed 11-year-old Valia Sherbakova, striking her several times on the head with a blunt object. On September 4, 1965, Gusakov raped and killed his second victim, a student named Yunova, again in the Tomolinsky Forest Park. By 1968, when he began his new murder series, the cases of his first murders had been classified. On March 11, 1968, Gusakov raped and killed two first-year female students, Olga Romanova and Elena Krasovskaya, in the attic of the Moscow Power Engineering Institute. There he left the murder weapon, a scrap from a steel water pipe, with his fingerprints on it. It turned out that the last time the girls were seen was with their classmate Oleg Ryabkov, but his fingerprints did not match those found on the murder weapon. On the wall of the attic, an inscription addressed to the murders was found, mentioning an Igor and Sergei. The investigators located the two young men mentioned, but their fingerprints did not coincide as well. In April 1968, Gusakov killed another 9-year-old girl, attacking a couple afterwards. During the attack, he hit the man with a blunt object and then killed the woman. However, the man survived and was able to describe his attacker. Since both crimes were committed in the Luberetsky district, the detectives decided to investigate all similar attacks in recent years. They then discovered that the murders of Sherbakova and Yanova were committed by the same criminal, as well as the murders of the three girls in the spring of 1968. On May 16, 1968, Gusakov met two 10th-grade girls in Serpukhov, Moscow Oblast, who he invited to go with him to the countryside. At first he tried to poison, then kill them with a cleaver, but when Gusakov tried to attack the girls, they escaped, where they alerted a nearby policeman who detained Gusakov. In 1969, a court found Gusakov guilty of 5 murders and he was sentenced to death. Despite several requests for clemency which were all rejected, in 1970 Gusakov was executed by firing squad in Moscow. The documentary film Beauties and the Beast from the investigation was conducted. Series on NTV. Valery Georgiyevich Asratyan. Valery Georgiyevich Asratyan was a Soviet suspected serial killer, convicted for the killing of 2 women in Moscow between 1988 and 1990. Asratyan, a previously convicted serial rapist and child molester, committed over 20 rapes of girls and young women during the 1980s. Later posing as a film director, Asratyan used anesthesia to render victims unconscious, killing several out of fear of being sent to prison before being apprehended in 1990. Asratyan was sentenced to death and executed at Butyrka prison in 1996. Valery Asratyan, also spelled Hasratyan, was born in 1958 in Yerevan, Armenian SSR, Soviet Union, to ethnic Armenian. He grew up in a stable household in a family that was considered prosperous by Soviet standards, and never experienced mistreatment or abuse during his childhood. In kindergarten, Asratyan would play doctor with girls, where he would undress and feel his patient, and at 13 years old lost his virginity to a woman that was 15 years his senior. He developed an interest in psychology and after finishing school chose to study at university, Armenian State Pedagogical University, in 1975 for a degree specializing in preschool psychology and pedagogy. Around this time Asratyan began reading Lolita Vladimir Nabokov, a book about a man who enters a sexual relationship with an underage girl, believing the book's main character, Humbert, paralleled himself. Asratyan graduated from the university in 1980 and began work as a psychologist at a school for children suffering from cerebral palsy and polio. In 1981, Asratyan married a woman from Moscow, the Soviet capital, and moved to the city with her the same year. Shortly after his relocation to Moscow, he began committing his first sexual crimes when he started raping young girls in the city, but was caught and sent to a penal colony. Asratyan was released in 1984 after serving only a 2-year sentence and almost immediately began committing rapes, again being convicted and imprisoned for 2 years in 1985. After his release in 1987, he moved to Veluky, Belgorod Oblast, for a short time but soon returned to Moscow, where Asratyan's wife ended their relationship and kicked him out of the house. Asratyan met another woman with whom he entered a civil marriage, and moved in with the woman and her 14-year-old daughter. The two assisted him when he continued his crimes in Moscow, where he began using potent psychotropic drugs, which included antipsychotics and tranquilizers. Asratyan also made himself a fake ID to gain the trust of victims, whom he found in the area of the Children's World Store. In February 1988, Asratyan began posing as a film director and lured a girl into the apartment under the pretext of screen tests. Mixing the psychotropic drugs into her coffee, he waited for the girl to fall into unconsciousness, raped her for several hours, took money and valuables. Asratyan then brought her to a railway station in the Podolsky district, Moscow Oblast, just outside of Moscow, and left her there. The girl was found, but could not remember anything. During this period, Asratyan committed more than a dozen rapes, and many of his victims would have been in his apartment for several days. Eventually Asratyan began to ruminate over the possibility of being caught, and in order to prevent his victims from being able to trace his crimes, began to kill them. Asratyan committed his murders with his next victims. His first victim was killed with a knife, and the second was drowned. In 1990, one of Asratyan's victims, who was left alive, and unlike previous victims had not completely lost her memory, reported him to the police. According to the victim, Asratyan offered women roles to play in his new movie, and showed police the area where she met him. Asratyan was arrested by a female police officer who had been invited to a casting in the same area as the surviving victim had met him. Asratyan quickly confessed to 2 murders and 17 rapes, as he was terribly afraid of being sent to prison and at his trial demanded the death penalty. As a convicted child rapist, Asratyan feared other prisoners would practice forcible sodomy on him, a common punishment in prisons for inmates who commit crimes against children. The court convicted Asratyan for the murders and sentenced him the death penalty, in which he was executed by firing squad in 1996 in Butyrka prison.